It began not with a whisper, but a thunderclap, war horses, iron chariots, and the brutal efficiency of the Assyrian Empire. In the 8th century BC, the northern kingdom of Israel, home to 10 of the 12 tribes, was overrun by Assyrian forces. The year was 722 BC, and Samaria, Israel's capital, fell after a prolonged siege. What followed wasn't just a military defeat. It was a cultural, spiritual, and historical vanishing act. The Assyrians, known for their policy of mass deportations, didn't just conquer people, they scattered them like seeds across their sprawling empire, replacing them with foreigners from other conquered lands. The result? A fractured identity, a people torn from their roots, and the start of a mystery that would last millennia. Those 10 tribes, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh, were, according to tradition, swallowed by history. Meanwhile, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained in the southern kingdom, eventually forming the foundation of what we now recognize as Jewish identity. But for the 10? Silence. No written records, no consistent oral histories. Just absence. But disappearances don't sit well with human curiosity. In fact, they tend to feed it. And this one, 10 entire tribes gone without a trace? That was irresistible. The first wave of wonder came from the exiled Jews themselves, survivors of a fractured nation trying to make sense of their losses. Prophets and poets sang laments and offered hazy glimpses of future reunions. In the book of 2 Kings, there's a vague but chilling account of the exiled Israelites being relocated beyond the river, possibly the Euphrates, and from there, the trail fades. But the hope remained. Centuries later, Babylonian exiles and post-temple Jews would still talk of their long-lost brethren. Not as a myth, but as a matter of unfinished business. Where had they gone? Had they forgotten their God? Were they even alive? Some said yes. Others suggested they had kept the faith better than anyone. Still others thought they'd mixed and disappeared into foreign cultures, their identities eroded by time and assimilation. The earliest written attempts to locate them border on the poetic. The apocryphal book of 2 Esdras, for instance, claims they crossed the mysterious Arzareth beyond the Euphrates to find a new homeland. Arzareth. Not on any map, but in the minds of many it might as well have been Atlantis, a land of preservation, of purity, of untouched Israelite tradition. A spiritual GPS with no coordinates. That seed of mystery bloomed into centuries of obsession. And yet, what if some of them had stayed closer to home? What if the scattering wasn't complete? Assyria's records, cold and bureaucratic, mention deportations, but they don't detail what happened afterward. Could some of the tribes have survived in pockets, hidden in deserts, mountains, or behind the veil of another name? The possibility electrified thinkers across generations. It gave rise to legends, tribes that hid beyond mountains guarded by rivers of fire. Tribes so devout they'd never broken a single law. Tribes waiting for the call to return. This wasn't just history. It was a haunting. A family portrait with missing faces. As the centuries ticked by, the loss of the 10 tribes became something more than historical curiosity. It was an ache in the soul of a people. During the time of Jesus, the Gospels even hint at the idea, mentioning the lost sheep of Israel, a phrase that would ripple through theology for generations. Some early Christian thinkers believed that the lost tribes had a future role to play in the apocalypse, in the grand reunion of all of God's people. Jewish sages debated whether the Messiah would bring them back, or whether they'd already disappeared beyond return. And then there's the elephant in the theological room. If God made a covenant with all 12 tribes, what did their disappearance mean? Had the covenant been broken? Did it transfer only to those who remained? Or were the 10 still somewhere out there, upholding their end of the deal in secret? These weren't just abstract debates. They shaped prayers, expectations, even politics. Because if the tribes could be found, if they returned, it would mean restoration, completion, redemption. The story of the lost tribes wasn't just a tale about people. It became a mirror reflecting hopes, fears, and the human need to believe that what is lost might yet be found. The roads of the ancient world twisted across mountains, deserts, and seas, trade routes humming with merchants, travelers, and whispers. As the centuries wore on, those whispers often carried strange stories. In the markets of Babylon or the harbors of Tyre, people spoke of distant peoples who followed unfamiliar customs, lighting candles on the Sabbath, avoiding pork, speaking in tongues that echoed Hebrew. For the descendants of Judah, these tales ignited something deep. Could these be remnants of their lost brothers? Could the 10 tribes have survived the fall and simply wandered beyond the known world? Even ancient Greek historians hinted at odd groups living far to the east, in places beyond Persia, who seemed to follow laws that felt oddly Mosaic. These echoes stirred questions, but nothing concrete. Still, in the absence of facts, stories flourished. The Silk Road, stretching from the Levant to the mysterious East, became more than a trade route. It was a vein pulsing with clues. There were rumors of Israelites in India, in China, in Arabia, in Ethiopia. Everywhere and nowhere at once. Jewish travelers, especially during the medieval period, would sometimes return with tales of distant tribes who had kept the old ways in strange lands. One of the earliest and most compelling came from Eldad Hadani, a 9th century Jewish traveler from East Africa. Eldad claimed he was a descendant of the tribe of Dan, and that the tribes of Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher had formed a powerful independent kingdom somewhere in Arabia or East Africa. He described their strict religious observance, their bravery in battle, and their complete isolation from the rest of the Jewish world. His stories were so vivid, so specific, that many took them as gospel. Others doubted, but no one could prove him wrong. He was the perfect blend of mystery and confidence, a recipe tailor-made for legend. Eldad's tales stirred a larger hunger. Soon, adventurers and rabbis alike were recording supposed sightings. In Persia, it was said that entire valleys were ruled by warrior priests from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. In the Caucasus, stories emerged of mountain-dwelling peoples who preserved ancient customs and spoke a strange version of Aramaic. These weren't just tall tales, they were breadcrumbs, and the world was eager to follow them. In Ethiopia, something more tangible appeared, the Beta Israel community, later known as the Ethiopian Jews. They claimed descent from the tribe of Dan, just like Eldad. They observed Jewish customs and holidays, used the Torah, and maintained practices that seemed disconnected from mainstream rabbinic Judaism, suggesting a long, isolated evolution. For centuries, no one quite knew what to make of them. Were they truly descendants of the lost tribes, or simply a community that had adopted Jewish practices independently? The debate never settled. But the power of their story made it almost irrelevant. They had survived. That was enough. The path of the lost tribes meandered even farther east. Some linked their disappearance to the Pashtun of Afghanistan and Pakistan, whose tribal names, such as Yusufzai or sons of Joseph, echoed those of Israelite patriarchs. These tribes practiced hospitality laws, had rituals resembling ancient Jewish customs, and even held oral legends that traced their ancestry to the sons of Jacob. Some scholars dismissed these as coincidence. Others weren't so sure. In a region where written records were scarce but oral traditions ran deep, the line between history and myth blurred constantly. The Lemba of southern Africa told a similar tale. Scattered across Zimbabwe and South Africa, the Lemba identified as a people apart, different from their Bantu neighbors, strict in dietary rules, and custodians of something sacred. Their legends spoke of a white city, of ancient priests, and a migration from Senna, in the north. Was Senna, Sana'a in Yemen? Or something older still? When DNA testing emerged centuries later, scientists discovered that some Lemba men carried the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic signature linked to the priestly line of Aaron. Suddenly, the story of the lost tribes was no longer confined to scrolls and campfire tales. It was written in blood. But even as these tantalizing signs emerged, one truth remained: there was no unified discovery. No grand moment when a messenger returned shouting, "I have found them!" Instead, there were only ripples, waves across time and geography. A law here, a legend there. The tribes had not reappeared in force. They had become something else: symbols, stand-ins for longing, perseverance, and divine mystery. As trade routes gave way to pilgrim roads, and empires rose and fell, the dream of finding the tribes refused to die. Some believed the tribes lived in isolation by choice, preserving the old ways until the appointed time. Others thought they had mingled into the fabric of the world, unrecognizable but ever present, strangers who unknowingly carried fragments of Israel within them. Either way, their story had become more than a hunt. It had become a search for identity itself. The roads they may have traveled, spanning Asia, Africa, and even distant islands, became sacred pathways. Every traveler who spoke a strange tongue or bore an unfamiliar custom was a potential clue. And every exile who returned to Jerusalem looked over their shoulder, hoping their long-lost cousins were right behind them. The medieval world was a curious blend of faith, fantasy, and fire. Crusaders marched with swords and crosses, monks copied ancient texts by candlelight, and kingdoms rose fueled as much by prophecy as power. In that world, the lost tribes of Israel were not a dusty footnote, they were a living hope. And sometimes, a dangerous one. By the 12th century, Europe was buzzing with tales of distant Jewish kingdoms hidden beyond the Muslim world. These weren't whispers anymore, they were grand, adventurous stories. The most famous of them all was the legend of Prester John. First circulated in the 1100s, the myth spoke of a Christian king ruling a vast, wealthy empire somewhere in the east, an empire populated by strange creatures, magical rivers, and yes, descendants of the lost tribes. Prester John wasn't Jewish, but his court supposedly included Jewish princes and wise men. The tale grew like wildfire. Letters allegedly written by the king himself were passed around Europe, claiming he ruled the 10 tribes, and would one day ride west to aid the Christians in defeating the Muslims. That mix of religious hope, geopolitical ambition, and exotic mystery captivated everyone from popes to peasants. The lost tribes were no longer just a Jewish concern, they had become a piece of the Christian imagination. But while Europe dreamt of empires and battles, Jewish scholars approached the mystery with a different kind of devotion. During the medieval period, rabbis, traders, and exiles scattered across the Middle East began seriously documenting rumors and leads. The famed traveler Benjamin of Tudela, a 12th-century Jewish explorer from Spain, journeyed across the known world, from North Africa to Persia, India to Constantinople. He meticulously recorded Jewish communities, and while many of his notes were factual, others veered into legend. Benjamin claimed that in Persia and beyond the Caspian Mountains lived over 300,000 Jews from the lost tribes, governed by their own laws and awaiting the Messiah. He described the river Sambation, a mythical river that roared with stones 6 days a week and rested on the Sabbath, making it impossible to cross. According to lore, the lost tribes lived beyond this river, untouched by foreign rule and fiercely devout. Many believed the river was real. Some thought it metaphor. Either way, the image stuck. By now, the lost tribes were more than history, they were a symbol of divine justice. For many Jews suffering under Christian rule, pogroms, and ghettos, the thought of a mighty Jewish kingdom somewhere far away, untouched and unbowed, was more than comfort. It was defiance. It was pride in a time of humiliation. Not all who searched were Jewish. Marco Polo, while traveling the Silk Road in the 13th century, mentioned peoples in Central Asia who had customs resembling those of ancient Hebrews. His notes, though sparse on detail, fed the growing belief that somewhere out there, maybe near India, maybe in the mountains of Tibet, the tribes endured. Some even believed they were being punished for something ancient, some disobedience that led to their banishment from both land and time. This gave rise to a darker tone in some theological circles. Perhaps the lost tribes weren't waiting to be found. Perhaps they were hidden by God as judgment. That duality, divine punishment versus divine preservation, haunted Jewish and Christian thinkers alike. Then came the age of false messiahs. Over the centuries, several individuals rose claiming divine missions, and some declared they had contact with the lost tribes. In the 17th century, a charismatic Jewish mystic named Sabbatai Zevi captivated Jewish communities across Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Many believed he was the long-awaited Messiah. Among his many promises? The reunification of the 12 tribes. His movement crumbled spectacularly after he converted to Islam under threat of death, but the hope he ignited didn't vanish. It proved how desperate the people were to believe that the tribes would one day return. There were other hoaxes too, travelers who faked letters, invented stories of tribes living behind mountains of darkness, or protected by angelic armies. Some did it for fame, others out of genuine belief. A few might have simply been mad. But no matter the source, their tales kept the fire alive. And through all of it, the lost tribes became increasingly unmoored from geography. They stopped being tied to specific places and instead lived in the spaces between, just beyond the known world, past the last river, behind the final mountain. Always just out of reach. This flexible mythology served many purposes. For Jewish communities under siege, it was a reminder they were not alone. For Christians, it became a prophetic puzzle piece, something that might trigger the second coming. For adventurers and empire builders, it was a target, a treasure, a prize. So they searched. From Portuguese sailors combing the African coast to Jesuit missionaries hiking the Himalayas, men in boots and robes followed trails they couldn't prove. And every time they encountered a strange tribe, an unfamiliar tongue, or a custom that echoed the Torah, they wondered, is this them? But they never found what they were looking for. At least, not the way they imagined. The lost tribes were too big, too sacred, too essential to be found with a map. By this point, they weren't just a group of people, they were a myth stitched into the very fabric of history. And myths, after all, don't disappear. They evolve. When European ships began carving their wakes across the globe in the 15th and 16th centuries, they weren't just after spices, gold, or land. They carried something else with them, stories. And high among those stories, nestled between the pages of Bibles and the minds of missionaries, was the enduring legend of the lost tribes of Israel. The age of exploration wasn't just a clash of cultures, it was a collision of myths and maps. The newly discovered Americas sparked a frenzy of speculation. Who were these people in the jungles and deserts? Where had they come from? Why did some of their rituals seem familiar? In the absence of understanding, Europeans often reached for the oldest answers they had. Maybe, just maybe, the tribes of Israel had made their way across the ocean. It sounds absurd now, but back then, the idea took root. Spanish and Portuguese explorers whispered that some Native American groups were keeping parts of the Mosaic Law. Some noted their use of purification rituals, dietary rules, or even oral stories about ancient migrations. Missionaries from England and France followed suit, suggesting that the tribes of the Americas might be the long-lost children of Jacob. It wasn't only a fringe idea. Prominent thinkers of the time took it seriously. In the 17th century, a Spanish Jesuit named Juan de Torquemada argued that the native peoples of Mexico were descended from the 10 lost tribes. Others, like English theologian Thomas Thorogood, wrote entire treatises, proving the same about Native American nations along the East Coast. What these writings lacked in evidence, they made up for in zeal. But why were so many Europeans eager to link the New World's people with ancient Israelites? The reasons were layered. Some were theological. If the tribes had scattered across the earth, as the Bible said, then surely they must have reached even these distant shores. Others were political. It gave missionaries a stronger justification to convert these lost brethren. And still others were deeply colonial. If the native peoples were merely wandering Jews, then perhaps Europeans weren't invaders, but spiritual rescuers. The fantasy continued in Africa and Asia. British colonists in India pointed to certain tribal groups, like the Bene Israel and Cochin Jews, as potential remnants of the tribes. In China, scattered Jewish communities like the one in Kaifeng drew similar attention. The logic was circular and often condescending, but the belief burned on. Then came the tale of Manasseh ben Israel, a 17th-century rabbi in Amsterdam. He was convinced the end times were near and that the Jews must be reunited before the Messiah arrived. Manasseh published a treatise claiming that Native Americans were indeed Israelites and urged Oliver Cromwell's government to allow Jews back into England, arguing that only by gathering the tribes could prophecy be fulfilled. It worked. Jews were readmitted to England after centuries of exile. In that moment, a myth had shaped actual policy. As Europe's empires expanded into Africa, they applied the same tribal filter to the people they met. The Igbo of Nigeria, for instance, were observed by colonial missionaries to follow customs that resembled Jewish laws. The Igbo, in turn, began to embrace this idea. Over time, many would come to identify themselves as descendants of the Israelites, an identity that persists today among certain communities in Nigeria, often with deep conviction and religious commitment. And then there were the Mormons. In the 19th century, as new religious movements sprang up in the United States, the lost tribes again took center stage. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints taught that the native peoples of the Americas were descended from ancient Israelites, specifically from the tribe of Manasseh. This belief, baked into their founding scripture, helped shape Mormon missionary work and ideology for generations. The myth had not just endured. It had become doctrine. Yet for every colonial or religious figure proclaiming new discoveries, there were skeptics. As anthropology and archaeology began to mature in the 19th century, many of these claims were exposed as wishful thinking or projections of European ideals onto indigenous peoples. But by then, the story had taken hold in hearts and minds across continents. What's fascinating is how the story changed depending on who told it. For missionaries, the lost tribes were souls to save. For explorers, they were a signpost of destiny. For colonizers, they were a justification. But for the people themselves, those labeled as tribes, the myth could be empowering. Some embraced it as a way to connect with an ancient heritage, to assert spiritual value in a world trying to erase them. In that sense, the story of the lost tribes began to flip. No longer just a European obsession, it became a global dialogue. People in Africa, Asia, and the Americas began claiming their place in the story, not as curiosities, but as heirs. They weren't waiting to be discovered. They were declaring, "We've been here all along." But still, the problem remained: no solid evidence. No ancient tablets or artifacts connecting these far-flung groups definitively to ancient Israel. And yet, the power of belief often outweighed the silence of science. People didn't need archaeological proof. They had tradition. They had faith. And sometimes, they had stories passed down through centuries that no historian could quite explain away. So the tribes remained lost, but not forgotten. They were now part of colonial lore, religious doctrine, and cultural identity. A global riddle, wrapped in centuries of longing and layered with hope. And the question lingered: if they were out there, who were they now? By the dawn of the 20th century, the search for the lost tribes of Israel had shifted gears. What had once been the stuff of legend, carried by caravans and missionaries, now entered the realm of science. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and eventually geneticists stepped into the story, magnifying glasses and microscopes in hand. The myth had survived conquest, religion, and empire. Now it faced data. At first, archaeology did little to resolve the mystery. Excavations in ancient Israel unearthed texts, temples, and shards of a civilization, but the fate of the 10 tribes remained a ghost. Most of what was found related to the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem sat, and where the tribes of Judah and Benjamin had remained after the northern collapse. The north, where the 10 tribes once lived, had been overwritten by centuries of conquest. Layer upon layer, Assyrian, Babylonian, Greek, Roman. As if the land itself had moved on. Still, curiosity thrived. Jewish communities around the world became the subject of fresh attention. Scholars began cataloging the customs, oral histories, and languages of groups that had long claimed Israelite ancestry: the Bene Israel in India, the Beta Israel in Ethiopia, the Lemba in southern Africa, the Beni Minashi in northeast India. The Lemba story gained traction in the 1990s when researchers conducted DNA tests on members of the tribe. One particular marker, the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic signature linked to the ancient priestly class of Jews, was found in a significant number of Lemba men, particularly those who claimed priestly descent. This was no longer just myth or missionary hope. It was biology. Something, at least, had survived the centuries. In India, the Beni Minashi, meaning children of Manasseh, emerged from the hills of Mizoram and Manipur. They followed rituals resembling Jewish law, lighting Sabbath candles, wearing prayer shawls, avoiding pork. Their oral tradition claimed descent from the lost tribe of Manasseh, and in recent decades, their story gained recognition. Beginning in the early 2000s, Israeli authorities began granting some members the right to immigrate under the law of return. Thousands moved to Israel, where they underwent formal conversion to Orthodox Judaism and began new lives in the land their ancestors had supposedly lost. But even as communities were embraced, doubts remained. Was the presence of a few rituals enough? Did cultural memory alone prove ancestry? Critics argued that centuries of contact with traders or missionaries might explain Jewish-like practices. Others pointed out that communities claiming Israelite descent often did so under pressure or as a means of survival. In colonized lands, aligning with a powerful religious identity could offer a shield. In others, it was a way to reclaim dignity after centuries of marginalization. In the Americas, some native tribes continued to quietly maintain stories of ancient migrations. The Navajo, the Hopi, and others had origin tales that some interpreted as echoing those of the Hebrews. But as native voices grew stronger in the 20th century, many rejected the imposed identity of lost Israelites as colonial fantasy. Their histories, they insisted, were their own, not European projections. The myth that once served as a bridge now risked becoming a form of erasure. Meanwhile, technology advanced. Genetic genealogy became a booming field. People mailed away their cheek swabs and waited for ancestry reports like they were lottery tickets. For many, the results confirmed known histories. For others, surprises emerged. Tiny percentages pointing to Middle Eastern origins, North African lineages, or traces of Sephardic Jewish ancestry in unexpected places. Yet even in the face of all this science, the central question persisted: what does it really mean to be a descendant of the lost tribes? Is it genetic? Is it cultural? Religious? Emotional? The answers were no longer simple, and perhaps they never had been. What's clear is that the lost tribes weren't as lost as we thought. They were simply scattered, woven into dozens of cultures, adapted through the lens of survival, and shaped by the lands they came to call home. Some retained threads of the old ways. Others created entirely new expressions of faith and identity. Some were recognized. Others still wait. In Israel today, the idea of ingathering the exiles still plays a role in national consciousness. Politicians and religious leaders debate who qualifies, how they should be received, and whether these scattered communities are truly part of the ancient family. The law of return offers a path, but not without hurdles. DNA helps, but doesn't decide. Faith matters, but must be proven. The line between inclusion and skepticism is delicate. But perhaps the most surprising modern twist is how the myth has inspired, not just for those claiming descent, but for others around them. In places like Nigeria, India, and Peru, groups have revived Jewish practices, built synagogues, and adopted Jewish learning, not out of fantasy but longing. The idea of being part of something ancient, chosen, and enduring remains deeply powerful. And who's to say that isn't real? After all, stories aren't just records of the past. They're tools of survival, resilience, and identity. In a world where people are constantly being told who they aren't, claiming a link to something ancient becomes an act of rebellion and of hope. The lost tribes, then, may not be waiting behind a secret river or hidden in a mountain kingdom. They may be right in front of us. In traditions passed down, in songs sung in distant tongues, in stubborn rituals that refuse to die. Not lost. Just unseen. The story of the lost tribes of Israel ends where all great stories do, not with a single answer, but with a deeper question. After thousands of years, the search has produced fragments, echoes, legends, and lives. But no one has ever found a city of 10 tribes waiting to come home. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the story was never about finding them. Maybe it was about not giving up the search. For many Jews throughout history, the lost tribes represented more than just kin. They symbolized wholeness, a vision of Israel complete again, reunited in faith and purpose. The loss of the tribes wasn't just a geopolitical event, it was a spiritual wound. A broken circle. So long as they were out there, the circle could be healed. In Christian tradition, the tribes became apocalyptic placeholders, mysterious actors destined to return at the end of days. Revelation spoke of 12 tribes sealed in heaven, each one preserved. Theologians debated what that meant. Some believed the tribes had become the Gentiles, others that they still wandered, waiting to fulfill prophecy. The ambiguity was part of the allure. But beyond religion, the story took root in the human soul. The idea that entire nations could vanish into time, unseen, perhaps unchanged, resonated with every people who had ever been displaced, exiled, or forgotten. In the tribes, humanity saw itself, scattered, searching, and surviving. Even today, in a world buzzing with information, the lost tribes remain one of history's great open loops. And in that loop, new identities have flourished. Ethiopian Jews, long marginalized and doubted, now live in Israel, building lives and serving in the military, their heritage a point of pride. The Bnei Menashe walk the streets of Jerusalem, carrying traditions rooted in the hills of northeast India. The Lemba debate their ancient roots while navigating modern South Africa. They are not props in a European legend. They are people, living, breathing, and shaping the future. At the same time, others have chosen the story, not by blood but by belief. In Uganda, the Abayudaya embraced Judaism in the early 20th century and faced persecution for it. In Latin America, descendants of conversos, Jews forced to convert during the Inquisition, have reclaimed their identity after centuries of silence. And around the world, individuals explore their DNA results and wonder, with a spark in their chest, could I be connected too? Yet the idea of lost is not always kind. It implies absence, even abandonment. Some critics argue that the endless search for the lost tribes can overshadow the lived reality of communities who have preserved Jewish identity in unconventional ways. That it can reduce people to puzzles, their cultures measured only in how well they match a preconceived template. But that's the tension at the heart of the legend. The lost tribes have always straddled two worlds, history and myth, fact and faith. They are at once real and symbolic. Their stories are preserved not just in scriptures or scrolls, but in lullabies, tattoos, recipes, and the faded memories of grandmothers who remember lighting candles on Fridays but don't know why. And still, we wonder. We imagine. We search. Perhaps that's because the story of the lost tribes is also the story of what it means to be human. To be scattered by war, or belief, or fate, and to still try to find your way back. To carry the memory of who you were, even as you become someone else. To pass down a name, a ritual, a melody, never knowing where it truly began, only that it matters. In a way, the legend continues not despite the lack of answers, but because of it. Each generation inherits the silence and fills it with meaning. A river that runs only on weekdays. A mountain beyond the maps. A people praying in a language no one taught them. These are not dead ends. They are doors. Doors we keep opening. So what happened to the lost tribes of Israel? Maybe they vanished. Maybe they scattered. Maybe they became something else entirely. Or maybe they're still here, not lost at all, but transformed. Living in unexpected places, wearing unexpected names, and carrying ancient hopes stitched invisibly into their lives. The mystery endures because it speaks to something eternal, the longing to belong, the hope that nothing sacred is ever truly lost, and the quiet faith that someday, somehow, all things will be made whole again. And that's why we still tell the story? That's why we still search.